Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Knut Berger.
And today we're getting out on the ice.
Yeah, it's definitely a glacier. You can see and there's a big glacier next to it.
In the late 19th century, just as the West's massive glaciers began to draw tourists, Mary Vox arrived in British Columbia. She not only climbed the region's peaks, but began photographing and measuring one glacier in particular, year after year. She's known as Canada's first glaciologist, an early documenter of retreating ice fields that are now vanishing even more rapidly.
You can see all kinds of little waterfalls and rivulets coming down. You can tell there's melt going on there.
If you haven't already seen the video, you might take a few moments to watch it. There are stunning shots of Mount Rainier and the Canadian Rockies, as well as of Mary Vox and her work. You can find the video in the show notes, but for now, let's head toward the snow line. Knut, do you remember the first time you saw a glacier, and did you know what it was? And was it on Mount Rainier?
I was going to say, I'm sure the first time I saw a glacier was when I looked at Mount Rainier as a child. And no, I didn't know what a glacier was. But, later on when we would go car camping and that kind of thing, we would go to Mount Rainier. We'd, go to places where there were glaciers and ice fields. I didn't really know what the difference between the two, but, there's a ice cave up at Big Four I used to go to when I was in summer camp and that kind of thing. So I was aware of large amounts of ice up in the mountains. As time went on, I began encountering glaciers. I went to Lake Louise, where there's a big glacier that comes down to the lake, and I don't think it comes down to the lake anymore, but it's still there, and other places in the Cascades. And, what really struck me was when somebody described it to me as a glacier is like a river of ice.
Yes.
And then right around that same time, I'm learning, well, this whole region was at one time covered with ice sheets. There were giant ice sheets, which were glaciers, and they came down. And I heard somebody say, that the glacier at its thickest over Seattle was like 4 or 5 space needles high, which is pretty unbelievable. So I definitely got an early sense that in earlier times there was a lot more ice. But I was still impressed with, and we'd go backpacking in the Cascades, you see glaciers, cross ice fields and that kind of thing. So you began to get, by adolescence, I had a much greater appreciation for what glaciers were.
Yeah, just a few years ago, I hiked up to see the Grinnell Glacier, and where it ends is at a lake, and it's so beautiful, so architectural. But I remember learning that it was just a small remnant of what it once was.
What had been there, yeah.
Yeah.
For much of our lives, glaciers have been retreating or advancing. They move, and they shape the landscape. And if you learn a little bit about the landscape, you can see the effect glaciers have had in the past, creating valleys, grinding around, mountains, creating, Matterhorn-type peaks when multiple glaciers are going in different directions. You get this sense that they're sort of the architects of a lot of the landscape. And I remember reading about John Muir and how he was one of the first and early proponents of talking about Yosemite, basically saying this landscape was created by glaciers, and this went against the science of the day, and they thought, oh, it's preposterous. But he was proved right. And so I think they're fascinating from a lot of different angles. And one of the things that got me interested, there are two things that got me interested in this story, one of which was, we had just done a series on the Columbia River. The Columbia, or some version of it, has existed for at least 17 million years. And the last episode of that series where we went to Columbia Lake, which is considered the headwaters of the Columbia. Today its headwaters are acknowledged as Columbia Lake,
an 8-mile-long body of relatively shallow water.
The glacier, it's fed by snow, ice, and glacier melt. And to some degree, that's lessening over time. And so it got me thinking about, well, what's the future of the Columbia River? So that was kind of one element of it. Another element was when we did an episode on early drivers going out into the countryside. Despite the lack of roads and maps, the allure of the outdoors drew steam, gasoline, and electric autos, and their increasingly middle-class drivers into the woods. And also tourists going by rail. That got me interested because glaciers, it turns out, were like this huge way to promote tourism in the West. And whether it was the Canadian Pacific, the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, the railroads were trying to get passengers onto trains, get them out into the far West. And what was the big draw? Mountains, of course. But what was on lots of those mountains? Glaciers. There was something about glaciers that was drawing people to them.
I've stayed at the Mini Glacier Hotel.
Right, exactly.
And that was one of those destinations that the railroads built to lure tourists to the beautiful Glacier National Park.
Yeah. And I became fascinated by this photograph that was I found online. And it's a photograph of a train and a bunch of like 1914 era automobiles and this massive crowd of people. And this was a race from Tacoma to Mount Rainier. And it was part of a promotion that became sort of known as 4 hours to the glacier, 4 hours to the mountain. It was a race between this train and people driving these cars. And the train won barely. But I was fascinated by the fact that the appeal was the Nisqually Glacier, which is one of the glaciers people are familiar with if you've been to Paradise. Mm-hmm. That was like a destination, and you could drive right to the foot of the glacier. And in fact, there was an ice cream stand right at the foot of the glacier. So for parched tourists. So I was just kind of fascinated with this element of glaciers as a tourist attraction and also, their history in the environment and shaping of the Northwest. I think it's the bigger one there, but I can't really tell until we could see more of the mountain.
Mount Rainier, of course, is the place closest to Seattle where you can see glaciers. As we've talked about, the Nisqually is maybe the most famous one, and features strongly in any story about glaciers in the Northwest. So naturally for this episode, you and your video team and Mossback podcast producer Sarah Bernard headed up to Crystal Mountain.
Great. Here we go.
Where you took a gondola up to the mountain. How was that?
Well, that was great.
Woohoo! I feel like I'm on a carnival ride right now.
Yeah. We thought about filming up at Paradise. We felt like, well, if we're talking about glaciers, we need to talk about Mount Rainier and show Mount Rainier. But, we weren't in a position to be able to hike up Mount Rainier to a glacier.
Have you ridden the gondola before?
Yeah, I've ridden it, yes. I've been up to the summit before. I can't remember how we got there. It must have been in a gondola.
And, it turns out that Crystal Mountain has, you can take a gondola up to the ridge. Yeah, it's kind of peaceful. Yeah. Sort of floating up here. Yeah. You're protected from the wind. You're at, between 7,000 and 8,000 feet. You have the Nisqually River coming down off the Nisqually Glacier. And in the background is just this fabulous portrait of the mountain. You can see the crevasses, the ripples. So we went down there and we took 2 days. The first day was sort of a scouting day. And of course, we got there, we went up in the, gondolas. We had arranged with the people there to haul our equipment up and do all that. Yeah, when we were first talking about this, somebody was like, we have to bring all the equipment up there. Can we do that? They thinking there was like a chairlift.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, no.
These doors do close.
It's a closed gondola. There's a fair amount of room in here for the equipment. They won't have trouble. But anyway, we got up there the first day, and the mountain, it was just totally socked in.
You never know with Mount Rainier, do you?
You never know.
See the shoulder hump now.
Yeah. It's going to go away in a second.
And we had delayed and delayed this shoot until fairly late in our shooting season. But we figured, well, August will give us the best chance. Well, it was like the worst possible thing,
That's why they call it the mountain in the clouds.
The mountain in the clouds and the sort of now you see it, now you don't mountain.
So the weather forecast says it should be less cloudy by this time tomorrow.
And we decided, okay, well, here's, if it clears, we'll be able to shoot it tomorrow.
Yeah, that's one thing about video and nature. You just never know, do you? It's always a bet.
Well, it's funny when we do stuff in the outdoors, you have trouble with, hikers walking by or planes flying over and that kind of thing. And we had some noise issues because they happened to be doing some work at Crystal. This was on the scouting day where there was a helicopter that kept taking off and landing and taking off and landing. And it was hauling some sort of equipment up the mountain. And they reassured us that this would not be happening the next day, but that would have made taping impossible.
That could mess up your audio a little bit.
So we spent the night, and the next morning, got up. I remember waking up early and going to the window, and of course you're in a valley, so you can't really see what's happening. You can't see the mountain from down there. But I remember looking up and seeing there was just clear blue sky above us. So we gathered all our stuff together, and then we had to wait for the gondola to open. If we would have gone up there at like 6 a.m, but we had to wait until it was open, and we got our equipment on, and the mountain was out.
So it was like, quick, let's get this shot.
Well, I could see clouds off to the side, and they were moving very slowly our way. Mm-hmm. And I could tell they're going to block the mountain if we don't hurry. So it was we had to be expeditious.
Well, early on, Mount Rainier became a tourist attraction. What is the evidence? What's the earliest evidence that you see of people visiting the glaciers on Mount Rainier?
Well, we know that indigenous people visited the mountain. And it wasn't until really the late 19th century that other people started to climb it. There are people who went by it and commented on it. I mean, whether it was Vancouver or Theodore Winthrop, who wrote a travel account of crossing Washington, talked a lot about Mount Rainier and what an incredible kind of savage and majestic entity it was.
Guides brought him to Mount Rainier, and it blew him away. He called it Tahoma. He liked that version of the indigenous name. He talks about its savage beauty. And that to me kind of underlines this thing of like, this is primitive wilderness.
He didn't specifically talk about the glaciers, but that's largely what he was responding to. I mean, Mount Rainier is the most glaciated mountain in the contiguous United States. And so it has more glaciers on one peak than any place else around. And it's part of that. When you say when did you first see a glacier? I mean, what we were seeing is a very unique mass of glaciers, plural, on Mount Rainier. And immediately people wanted to find ways to get up to the top of the mountain. That just seemed to be something that people had to do. And then it became a much more regular thing as outdoor sports in the late 19th century began to kind of take off here.
These kinds of glaciers were not being found in eastern mountains. And so this was the sort of discovery of the West, of the Rockies and the Cascades.
Mount Rainier was one of the first 4 national parks. So it was a national park early on. People recognized it was special. But, if you're talking about Mount Hood, if you're talking about, other places in the Rockies, in the Cascades, in the Selkirks, the idea of building lodges that train loads of tourists can And a lot of it had to do with, people seeing that what we had here was even more incredible than, say, Switzerland. I mean, that was a popular glacier, ice field, mountain climbing destination in Europe. A lot of Americans had gone over, but, we're hearing about that from other places. And it was sort of like, well, this beats that.
Well, then Alaska.
Well, yeah, Alaska, that's a whole other level.
The cruise industry to Alaska to see glaciers.
Yeah, that's the cruise industry of the late 19th century and early 20th century was trains, right? The cruise industry now is, those big honking cruise ships that come into Seattle every summer and take people up to see the glaciers and the glacial activity. And when you see that, you see that kind of activity and those kinds of glaciers in Alaska, it's probably, more reminiscent of what some people were experiencing in the lower 48 at that time.
Let's talk about Mary Vox. In reading about her and watching the video, I'm surprised her name doesn't come up more often, especially in the Northwest. Who was Mary Vox, and how did she first end up in British Columbia?
So she was completely unknown to me when I started kind of poking around. So after we did the Columbia River episode, I was just doing some looking online at what's happening to the glaciers in British Columbia because they're melting more rapidly than they have in the past, and there's some fairly dire predictions about how long the coast mountains and others will have glaciers at all. And of course, that's an issue in Glacier National Park, which is losing its glaciers. And while I was, poking around, I saw a reference to her. And it mentioned that she was an early person who recorded glacier retreat before most people were doing that in a systematic way. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I also noticed that she came out on the train to a lodge in the Selkirk Mountains on the Canadian Pacific route. And that was curious to me because of this interest in the fact that these lodges and trains were responsible for bringing people out. And here's somebody who came out as a result of that and suddenly got fascinated by glaciers.
Where was she from? Where did she come out from?
She was a member of a fairly well-to-do Quaker family from Pennsylvania. She was an American. And her father took the whole family on a tour of the West. So they came out west. They went to Yosemite and a bunch of other places. And on the way home, they were heading through the Selkirks. And at that time, the route took them to right by a lodge that was at the foot of the Illecillewaet Glacier, which then was called the Great Glacier. And it was a massive glacier in the Selkirk Range that came down, and tourists could come and they could stay at the lodge and hike up to the glacier. And the people who ran the lodge knew that they had a great thing here. There was this like great access to big ice right there, and they hired guides from Switzerland to come and take people on guided tours of the ice. Well, Mary became very fascinated with this. She climbed on the glaciers, she and her brothers, and she's a young adult at this point. So she goes back to Philadelphia, and then some years later comes back out. And she notices that this glacier that she saw in the early 1880s has retreated. It's much smaller than it was when she was out there, 5, 6, 7, 8 years before. And she became fascinated. She was a photographer. So she began photographing, documenting the glacier, climbing all over it. There are these magnificent photos of her in her bloomers and standing, way up on the ice. I mean, on this glacier with these giant blocks of ice around her, and she's holding an axe, and it just blows my mind, because today we have
there's so much equipment and safety kind of stuff. And these guys were just tromping out there with their boots or skirts or, jodhpurs.
So, she's an early woman alpinist, but she and her brothers have this sort of scientific interest. And that's very early in people taking an interest in, this glacier is retreating. How far is it retreating? How much is it retreating?
Well, how did she measure it?
Well, they would go out and they would take exact measurements, and then they would pound metal stakes to show where the glacier was. And then the next year they'd come out again and see, it's retreated 20 feet or whatever. And she had a camera and with glass plate negatives, the big kind. The big kind and later smaller versions. But she's out there taking high resolution pictures not only of climbing, of people on the glaciers, but also documenting this sort of retreat.
But they were shooting, and then they would develop the film. And they put a tent together with blankets, or they would stay at the lodge, and she would use that as a dark room. At night it would be pitch black, so she could develop the film.
And so it's a very early kind of focus on what's happening to the glaciers and systematically year after year. So she did this, for like 30 years. She came out every year and she created a record. She and her brothers, they wrote papers about it. They got some of those papers published. They wrote down all the stuff, and they had the photographic evidence to back it up, which, began this whole study of, glaciers don't always advance. They retreat.
Can you tell from the evidence, from reading her work, whatever they published, was there a sense of foreboding and doom like we have today about this glacier retreating? Because I would imagine that there was no thought of human-caused climate change with regards to the use of fossil fuels, et cetera, like there is today. I mean, we know why glaciers are retreating, and we have an idea of what is going to happen. Where were they with this back then?
Yeah, I don't get a sense that there was any sense of foreboding. I think they were just recording a natural phenomenon. Within our lifetime, some glaciers are advancing, some are retreating, some are gaining mass, some are losing mass. That balance is tipped in more recent years as to where there's more consistent loss. But, people now know, glaciers don't all behave the same way. But when you can see that many of them are behaving in a certain way, like melting, and it's happening all over the world, you have much more of a glacial, sort of consciousness. But I don't sense there was any foreboding about it. I think they were just curious about documenting it.
So was she contributing to science in real time? Was her work being noticed? And was it contributing to a scientific discussion?
Yeah, the work she and her brothers were doing, and did get noticed. People did note it, and eventually her brothers stopped coming out. They weren't as into it as she was in terms of coming out. They had careers and whatnot. She really made this a central part of her life. And, she mentioned she's also a mountain climber. She visited other places. And one of the things that grew out of that, and what she's known for in this country, is this epic multi-volume work that she did on North American wildflowers.
Well, I was going to say, when I was Googling and doing some reading on her, the first thing that popped out is that she was a botanical artist, and that work was donated to the Smithsonian, and she's an expert.
Yeah, I mean, I've even heard people say that she's sort of the Audubon of wildflowers. That work was really incredible, both the research that she did, studying the plants, finding the plants, and also then rendering them in beautiful, realistic colors. And this was part of kind of a later stage of her life. You know, in the beginning, she and her brothers are coming out, hanging out at the glaciers, exploring the mountains around the area. The brothers then sort of cease coming out. She continues to come, and she does all her own photography, by the way. So she's lugging the stuff up. She might get help with people carrying it and whatnot, but she's doing the photography. So she's like really on her hands and knees a lot, engaged with observing nature, enjoying nature, hiking, and all that. And then a little bit later in life, in the early 20th century, she meets a paleontologist who happens to be head of the Smithsonian, Charles Doolittle Walcott, and they get married. So during those years, he is known as the discoverer of the Berger Shale, which is a nearby collection or discovery of a collection of a fossil deposit that completely revolutionized our knowledge about how life evolved, because it preserved earlier critters that people didn't know about and didn't know existed like that at that time. So he's this, famous paleontologist, highly respected. They're now a couple, and they begin returning to the Rockies and to the Selkirks. He goes with her every year. And this is while she's working on this work that the Smithsonian then publishes, I'm sure, with his sponsorship and whatnot.
Well, not only that, if that wasn't enough, you wrote that she's the first woman to summit a peak taller than 10,000 feet.
Yeah, that's what I've read. And it's in this era of, when the Mountaineers developed, the Mazamas, the climbing club in Oregon, which actually preceded the Mountaineers. You're getting people in general. The tourists aren't satisfied with just staying in a lodge. They might stay in a lodge, but they're also camping. They're also climbing mountains. They're climbing glaciers. They're adventuring more. And she was definitely part of that cohort in that era. And the photographs document that very well, too.
What do people say about her in her time? Is she known for her work?
I think it's after mostly, in that I think that she's mainly known for her wildflower work and this multi-volume series of these images. That was very important. But I think that she is not particularly well known. I mean, there's a mountain named after her, Mount Mary Vox. It's in Jasper National Park. Mm-hmm. But, she's not a household word. I think partly what happened was people later came along and saw the body of work that she created. It's all of her photographs and whatnot are in a museum in Banff. And also, as people have more recently become interested in the behavior of glaciers and in glacier retreat, in climate change and that kind of thing, her work, I think, then was rediscovered in terms of people saying, wow, here is somebody who was like way ahead of us. There's so much work going into monitoring glaciers and behavior. There's so much denial about climate change and these kinds of things that having photographic evidence that goes back not just 100 years, but, goes back 150 years or, is special. That's not common. And I think one of the things in our video, which people should click on and check out just for the visuals, is this before and after, or then and now component of glacier behavior. So the Illecillewaet Glacier was a half-hour walk from the lodge where Mary worked, right? Staying at the lodge, she can walk a half hour, and she's right at the foot of this massive glacier. It's a 4-hour hike today. That glacier has retreated so far up the mountain, it would take you 4 hours to get there. And the lodge no longer exists. There's the railroad rerouted and the lodge shut down. But nevertheless, people still climb up to the glacier. Mm-hmm. But I think it's the kind of thing that brings home dramatically a story that we're seeing playing out, internationally. And whether you think it's a crisis or not, might depend on your political views, but it's undeniable that we're in a period of rapid glacier shrinkage.
Well, Mount Rainier, as you said, has more glaciers than any other mountain in the lower 48. Where are Mount Rainier's glaciers in this flux? What's going on there?
Well, they're shrinking. I'm thinking it's maybe 3 glaciers have disappeared recently, in recent years, that are now there.
Of 30?
Like the Stevens Glacier, yeah. So you've got 3 that have basically vanished within the last few years. And at best, they're like the Stevens Glacier is like just a little patch of ice, basically. It's no longer a frozen river moving dynamically. And so they're disappearing one by one. And then you can see this, though, all throughout the Cascades. You can see it in the Canadian Coast Range, the Canadian Rockies. Glacier National Park used to have maybe 80 glaciers, something along those lines. It now has, 25? Those are thought to be gone within the next few decades. I mean, within the lifetime of many people alive now. And we also know what's happening in the Himalayas and, Switzerland. So much so that the news reports you hear about glacier discoveries today have to do with, whether an ancient corpse fell out of one or, a climber who disappeared in 1908 is found. We're recovering artifacts from where the ice has been from earlier times. So, the story is they're diminishing. And the question is, what's the significance of that?
Thanks for listening to Mossback. The video series is now in its 11th season. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this or any season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. And now, if you prefer to watch your podcasts, you're in luck. Head to YouTube to see a brand new video version of the Mossback podcast. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Studio recording and setup by Rusty Bacall, Victoria Ralph, Roger Basquette, Lucy Barrera, Yamina Stiet, and Matt Brott. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen. And whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you want to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, join the members who make Mossback's Northwest possible. Your donation will help fund the Cascade PBS lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, local news, and more. Plus, members receive great member benefits, including Cascade PBS Passport with extended access to an on-demand library of local and PBS favorites. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knut Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Go to cascadepbs.org/membership to sign up today. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.